Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of All Been Done. Today's guest is Robert Conn, wonderful midfield player for the Dons in the late 80s and early 90s. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. Now, without further ado, let's get into the episode. Welcome along to episode 4 of All Being Done. Delighted to be joined by my guest today, Robert Connor. Robert, thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Your Aberdeen career, you joined the Dons in 1986 from Dundee. You were already quite an established player, of course. You played for Scotland before joining the Dons. What are your memories about the initial approach to join Aberdeen? Were there rumours before that, or was it a bit of a surprise?
No, it wasn't a surprise. There were rumours at Dundee at the time. There was a bit of confusion because Jockey Scott was the manager at Dundee at the time. Obviously, Archie Knox had left the previous season, went back to Aberdeen. And at that time, there was two transfers became kind of common knowledge, or two teams interested in Dundee players at the same time. One was Hearts, who were interested in John Brown, and one was Aberdeen that were interested in myself. And Jockey had told me that the Hearts one was further down the line, and that they were in discussions with Hearts regarding a transfer fee and everything for John. The personal terms had been agreed. So if John went to Hearts, then I wouldn't be going to Aberdeen, or the talks hadn't even opened with Aberdeen. So basically, they were only going to lose or sell one player. And if John had went to Hearts, then they wouldn't even have started talking to Aberdeen about my transfer. So fortunately for me, and probably in the long term, fortunate for John Brown as well, he failed a medical because he had no cartilages in his knees, which was for somebody, I think he was only about 25 at the time or something like that. And he had all or mostly all of his cartilages taken out his knees. So Hearts didn't sign him for that reason, and my move to Aberdeen went ahead and went through. And as I say, fortunately for John as well, it was only a matter of months probably before Rangers came knocking at his door, and Dundee sold John to Rangers, and he was there for a long time after that. So probably worked out better for both of us that the Hearts thing fell through for him.
Definitely, by the sounds of it. So, like in that sort of time as well, like if that transfer had been now and you'd been linked with a team like Aberdeen, who were like the big team at the time, and they're saying, well, you're not going to go if we sell John Brown to Hearts. Now a player would be like, well, I'm not going to play unless you sell me. So it's a different mentality. Was that what it was like then? It was more of well, I'm not going there, so I'll just carry on playing for Dundee.
No, it was a totally different time, and I was kind of brought up in an era where when I joined Ayr United as a young player, there were no agents, and the contract situation with players was different before the Bosman situation came in. So the club held your registration. So even at the end of your contract at that time, way back before the Bosman era, you weren't free to leave the club at the end of your contract, because whoever wanted another club, if they wanted you, they would have to pay a transfer fee to buy your registration for your contract. That's how it worked at that time. So I was brought up in that era when it wasn't, you just jump from club to club to club, if you like. When your contract finishes, you were really bound to the club that you played for unless that club agreed to let you go. So that was always, that was kind of set in my mentality, that was kind of how it worked. At the time in Dundee in 86, at that point, that's when agents were relatively new at that time on the scene. And I didn't have an agent. I don't think John Brown had an agent, but there was only one or two players at that point who had agents. they quickly picked up in the kind of following years, and more players had agents. But even to the end of my time in 1994, well, I left Aberdeen in 94, went to Kilmarnock. I was never involved with agents. There were one or two players at Aberdeen at the time. I know Stuart McKimmie had an agent, and another couple, obviously Charlie Nicholas came to Aberdeen, he obviously had an agent. But even like Sir Willie Miller and Alec McLeish, they did their own stuff as well. Probably that's why they stayed at Aberdeen for for all their careers. So I think players at a certain age kind of had a different view on whether it was right to move and just jump from club to club. I think they had a wee bit more respect for the club that they were at. But I think nowadays it's went the opposite way. Whereas the clubs abused that system and they held on to players, unhappy players could be left just to malinger, for a year or two until their contract ran out. But now, and clubs did abuse it that way, but I think now certainly players, and maybe no players, but agents in particular abuse it the other way. So as usual with most things, there's never a happy medium, so. Mm. But no, that's how it all happened at Dundee to Aberdeen for me.
And did you have to be sold on the move then, or were you like, yeah, no, I want to go here, I want to go and play with these guys, or did the manager sell it to you? What was involved in that? Was it an easy negotiation?
Well, what was involved in that was Jockey brought me into the office after training one day and said John's move to Hearts had fell through. Alec Ferguson and Archie Knox are coming down to speak to you this afternoon. So just hang about here, don't go home. And Archie and Fergie duly arrived. I knew Archie obviously because he'd been the Dundee manager for the 2 years I was there. But Fergie basically just said, Archie's told me a lot of good things about you. When you come to Aberdeen, we're looking for this, that, the next thing. So I'll get the paperwork all sorted out here and just leave it with saying, you sign that and I'll see you tomorrow in Aberdeen. And away went. So that was so duly obliged, I signed the contract and went up to Aberdeen the next morning.
Within a matter of, weeks he's gone, is it?
Yeah, it was a couple of months, I think, before he went to Manchester United. But I mean, there was obviously lots of stories about Fergie and being a bit wild in the hairdryer and all that kind of stuff. But to be honest, when I was there for the couple of months, he was fairly mellow. And I think back in hindsight, it was because I think he maybe knew that there was a chance that he was going south. He turned down a few big clubs down south because I think he wanted to get the Man U job. I think that was what he wanted to do, and he waited in that until it happened, basically. So, but I think he was a wee bit milder than he had been previously. I think he had kind of achieved so much at Aberdeen. There wasn't really anything left for him to achieve, and he needed a new challenge, a bigger challenge. And I think he went on, and the rest's history. The great the legacy he left at Manchester United.
Of course. So when you first started, obviously you'll have played against most of those players in the previous few seasons, but how did you feel when you went into training and stuff? Who impressed you in that squad?
It was a bit slightly different. When Archie was at Dundee, and I saw that when I went to Aberdeen subsequently, I saw the kind of the similarities. Archie had tried to do similar things at Dundee, but it was, Aberdeen, Fergie had been there for quite a few years. It was well entrenched, everything that Fergie had put in place. And what struck me most really was in the dressing room, with Willie Miller, Alec McLeish and Jim Leighton at the time, that triangle as they called it there. And Willie Miller and Alec in particular were very, very vocal in terms of how important it was to win every game, and how important success was to the club, and how, you know, how absolutely disappointed they were if we didn't win a game, if we drew or whatever. Then there was a big show of that failure it's not accepted, basically. So that was a big difference, because Dundee were a club just when I went there, they were just out the first division, trying to establish themselves in the Premier League, and survival was the main thing. So to see the other side of the coin, where winning every game is so important. If we obviously, winning games is important at Dundee, but for a different reason. It was to try and keep your head above water. We'd win a game, lose a game, draw a game, win a game, and if you get 2 or 3 wins, it's good. We're seeing ourselves, 6th in the table or 5th in the table. We're doing well. That's a success for Dundee, but for Aberdeen, you had to be top of the table, or you had to be winning the cups, that type of thing at that time. And that's what Fergie had instilled at the time there. And that kind of, in the dressing room, came out from specifically Willie Miller and Alec McLeish. And that's what really kind of struck me most, that was so visible at the time.
And how did you find that personally? Did you find that easy to get into that new mentality, or did you struggle a little bit with it?
Well, it's just another form of trying to be successful, I think. I think when I look back in my career, I think I was fortunate in terms of when I arrived at clubs, except Aberdeen, maybe the opposite there, because when I arrived there, Graham Souness arrived at Rangers and unleashed all this money and brought in all these big players. So, but all the other clubs I was at, with Ayr United, then Dundee, just in the Premier League. When I left Aberdeen, I went to Kilmarnock, who were just in the Premier League. They were all ambitious, but in a different way from Aberdeen. Aberdeen wanted to win things, whereas the ambitions of these other clubs were to survive. That was their goal. So we always had a goal. There was no teams that were expecting to get relegated, thinking with that kind of losers mentality. They all had a winning mentality to try and win games, and the managers were the same. So I always think I was quite lucky in that respect, that I was never at a club that got relegated, or I was never in a club that felt they might get relegated. There was always a positive mentality at the clubs. So the only difference at Aberdeen was that the positive mentality meant winning things, winning leagues or winning cups. But as I say, 86 coincided with Graham Souness arriving at Ibrox, and then making the playing field a wee bit uneven. Whereas in financial terms, because the playing field previous to that had been pretty level, Rangers and Celtic always had a wee bit more money than likes Aberdeen, but Aberdeen were successful, so they were. And Dundee United to a different respect, because Jim McLean liked to. He would reward the players, which is, people say it was a great way of looking at it. He would reward the players for, first of all, appearing in the first team, secondly, winning games. So they might have been on a low basic, but if they appeared in the first team, they would get a big appearance money bonus. And if they win the game or drew the game, they would get much bigger than the Aberdeen bonuses, although the Aberdeen basic wages were higher. But in terms of Dundee United were successful and Aberdeen were successful, money-wise, there wasn't much difference in what the players would get. Whereas Rangers and Celtic were a bit better, they were a bit higher. But when Souness came to Rangers, that just went through the roof. And the gulf in terms of finance, as it remains today, that's when that started.
Is that something that
it was difficult to compete against that?
Is that something that, like, as a squad, it would start getting talked about? It was like, oh my God, they've just signed the England goalie, or they've just signed, Terry Butcher. It's like, what's going on there? How are we going to be able to compete with that sort of thing?
Aye, and I think in a couple of different ways, because you begin to hear, as you do in any industry, you begin to hear the wages the players are getting and that type of thing. So guys like Willie Miller, Alec McLeish, who'd been at Aberdeen for a long time, began to, well, Terry Butcher's just arrived at Rangers and Chris Wood's just arrived, and instead of getting kind of talking about the hundreds or the 1,200 quid a week, we're talking about hundreds of pounds a week. They began to talking maybe thousands or tens of thousands a week, you know. And then you see the likes of Willie and Alec thinking, geez, we've done all we've done up here, we've won what we've won, and these guys are appearing from nowhere and getting all this money, you know. So probably affected them more than the likes of myself, who just came to Aberdeen at that point. Then I had gradually increased my wages going from Ayr to Dundee to Aberdeen, so just a normal thing. But the likes of the experienced players who had won European tournaments and won leagues and that type of thing are now competing against a Rangers team that's totally transformed, and the players there are getting rewarded with tremendous financial incentives and wages and that type of thing. So it all changed then when Souness came, and even Celtic were left behind. But Aberdeen, I mean, I was at Aberdeen for 8 years, and I think in these 8 years, I think we were second behind Rangers in the league 5 times, which is probably a legacy from the Miller and McLeish era. They were still there. Jim Bett, there was a few changes made, obviously, but the Aberdeen were still a strong side and still wanted to compete. Just gradually through the years, it became obvious that Rangers were moving into a different stratosphere. And then when Fergus McCann came to Celtic, then he transformed them, and when he left them, he left them in a very good position, and they were able to compete with Rangers. So Celtic and Rangers at that point had moved away from Aberdeen and Dundee United. So there was definitely a top two, and then Dundee United, Aberdeen, Hearts, Hibs, if you like, and the rest. So there was a big split there, and I think it became difficult for the players, the manager, the fans as well to accept, you know, because we had been very competitive up until that point, and gradually got slightly less competitive as the years went by, and we are where we are now, and I don't think there'll be a club out with the Old Firm will win the league ever again.
Unless somebody in Saudi Arabia decides to take a love for Rowies or something like that and decides to buy the Dons or something, I don't know. So as the first couple of years at Aberdeen, obviously, and then Ian Porterfield was there for a bit, and then Alex Smith and Jockey Scott, as you mentioned, and that was that year you had 3 League Cup finals against Rangers, losing the first 2 and then finally winning the second one. And the influx, almost, maybe not quite influx, it was only 4 or 5 people, of the Dutch market, obviously, like Van der Ark, Snelders, Paul Mason coming over from the Netherlands as well. What are your memories of that sort of time, the players coming over to the Netherlands, and then particularly winning the 1990 League Cup and Scottish Cup?
Well, whoever replaced Fergie it was always going to be a no-win situation. And Ian Porterfield was there for a couple of years, I think, and brought a couple of players to the club. But we didn't really have any great success at that point. But when Alex Smith came with Jockey Scott and Drew Jarvie, then they bought very well in the market. I mean, the Dutch players all made a contribution, some a wee bit more than others, like Theo Snelders and Hans Heelhuis, I would suggest, probably the biggest impact. Paul Mason, who's no Dutch, but came for that side, had a tremendous input as well to the club. And then big Willem van der Aert, Peter van de Ven, and latterly Theo ten Kaat also made a good contribution. Big Willem, a bit of a cult hero now with his supporters. Also made a good contribution as well. So I think at that stage, certainly 89, 90, 91, when we lost the league to Rangers at Ibrox on the last day, in my time at the club, was the best spell when the Dutch players get brought in. And and we competed very well. And I mean, in the year you're talking about, we won both cups. I think I'm right in saying we beat Celtic in the semi-final. Oh, sorry, we beat Celtic in the final of the Scottish Cup, but we beat Rangers in the final of the League Cup. I don't know who we played in the semis. So I think it was one of the cups we beat one of the Old Firm in the semi and the other of the Old Firm in the final. So we didn't.
Yeah, I think it was Dundee United in the Scottish Cup. It was Dundee United in the Scottish Cup semi-final. I was speaking to Brian Irvin last week, and he was talking about it.
Oh, right, he knows that. He's got a better memory than me.
He does. He's got an encyclopedic memory for games. That boy. He was rattling through every fixture and the scores and everything. It was like on the internet.
He's obviously not got a lot to do with his time nowadays. He'll be reading all the books. No, and in the League Cup, the third, as you say, of the trilogy, which, fun enough, all the games were good games. You know, the cup final was the actual. If any neutral went along to watch the game, the actual game of football itself, the 3 games we played against Rangers were all good games, good high standard and few goals and that type of thing, which is sometimes unusual for a cup final because there's a lot at stake, so it can be cagey, as was the Scottish Cup final against Celtic, which was a poor game. But the 3 League Cups against Celtic, all great games, and fortunately we did manage to win the last one, but we had to win it because before, when we were lining up in the dressing room before we went out on the park, Big Alec shouted to everybody, as he usually did, but no in this respect, but he turned around and shouted to everybody, right, if we don't win this one, don't even bother coming back in. So we knew that we had to win that one. Unfortunately, we did.
It's been a couple of years since the club had won something as well, and like obviously being so used to success, and obviously, as you said, as you touched on earlier, the change at Ibrox as well, and then going to Ibrox in '91 to need that draw. The team went on such a run, in the lead up to that game. It was 7 points behind with 10 games to go, and you go to Ibrox, just needing a draw to win the league. You're like 12 games undefeated in the build up to that as well. What was it about that particular team in that run that just worked? Was the team settled? Was everybody just on form at the same time? What sort of worked?
Yeah, I think we had the Dutch players had been there for a couple of years, and we had a pretty established setup. There's a couple of young players that came through at the time. Ian Jess and Scott Booth, in particular, made a big impact in the first team, and a few other young players as well were coming through too. So it was a good. As I say, that was my. If I look back, that was the best time at the club, because I think the first team, in terms of a pretty settled side, maybe had 13, 14 players that were playing every week. And we had young players that were pushing the older players as well, a bit of enthusiasm and good legs as well. So I think that was, there's no any doubt that was at the strongest team we had in my time at the club. But I think we had guys like, and as I said previously, Hans Hielhuis, who was a fantastic player for the Scottish League, you know, in any league really. He was a terrific player, Hans. And we had a pretty settled side as well. And I think in that run, we had more or less the same team out every week. And that was one of the things that it was a decision that Alex Smith and Jockey and Drew made in the final game of the season, when they changed they changed the personnel and the formation, which they did we didn't know this until the day of the game. So
right.
They changed that situation. So, and Alex Smith in the team meeting before we went to Ibrox said that because I think we'd played 4-3-3 all the way up to through that run, and he changed it to 4-4-2. And the reason he says it wasn't being negative, but he said he genuinely felt, looking at Rangers and looking at us, this was the best. It was the best way we could win the game. He didn't want to draw the game, he wanted to win the game. So he was making the change for that reason. Now, obviously in hindsight, in the game itself, we had a couple of chances. We'd one early on and one later in the first half, I think. Normally, certainly the one Hans Heelhuis had, where he had a header at the back post, pretty close range. He headed past the post instead of in the goal. So we were, as a team, still confident of going there and winning the game because we were in a great run. And I mentioned the fact that Alec changed the formation and the personnel because the easiest thing for him to do would just be to stick with the same team.
Mm-hmm.
Don't change it. Stick with the same team. That's me thinking in hindsight. You don't really think about these things for too long at the time because you've got the game in front of you. But in hindsight, after the game and when you're depressed and thinking back on it, I wonder why the manager did that. But the easy thing for him to do, and he took a lot of stick, and I think ultimately that cost him the Aberdeen job the following season when they get the sack and Willie took over. But it would have been easy for him, the easiest thing to do, just keep the same team. And if we lost, then, nobody would have been critical of him because we had such a great run. Who would change the team?
Mm-hmm.
Because we lost, that's why he got all the criticism. Why did he change the team and all the rest of it? So I can understand that point of view, and probably a point of view I agree with. But I have to emphasise the fact that Alex Smith obviously did believe that he was making the change to win the game, and he knew that he would be hung out to dry if we didn't win the league. So it probably took more courage for him to do that than stick with the same team, which is, I'm not saying what he did was right, but what I'm saying, he must have really believed that was the best way to do it.
So if you change in a formation change like that to a 4 rather than a 3, how much change is there in your personal game? Like, is it where you're looking or where you're passing? Does that change because there's 4 people across the midfield and you're maybe picking up somebody else that you normally wouldn't have if you were playing in a 3?
Well, because we had played the same formation for the good run we had been on. What happens in that case is that you become used with the players that you're playing in your area of the field. You know where the players are or will be on other areas of the field as well if you're looking for switches or play, that type of thing. So you become comfortable with the people that are round about you, how they play, what they do. You recognise circumstances and you know what they're going to do before they do it, because you become used to how each other thinks and how each other plays. So it disrupts that slightly, but we were, Aberdeen at that point were a mostly experienced side with a couple of youngsters, so it wasn't really a major factor in that the players couldn't play that 4-4-2. Obviously more than capable of doing that. But it slightly disrupts the kind of flow, if you like, when you're in possession of the ball, of how you play the game and how you move forward and that type of thing. But not to the degree that it was something that the players weren't capable of doing.
That summer after that, obviously everyone's going to be pretty flat, given what's happened. And then just early on in the season, Jockey Scott leaves for Dunfermline, and it just leaves Alex Smith on his own managing the club. Was Jockey's departure, was that an influence? Did the two of them work well together, and then taking one element of that away, did that change things a little?
Yeah, I think Alec and Jockey and Drew Jarvie worked very well together. I think Alec Smith was the manager as such. I think they were titles were co-managers, but and Alex Smith was the manager as such. Jockey Scott was more hands-on with the players, training and that type of thing. Jockey Scott's a brilliant coach, probably the best coach that I was involved with during my career, and he would obviously with discussions with Alec and Drew, and they would work with the player. Jockey would work with the players, set up all the training during the week with training functions, and then maybe shadow play as to what we were going to do with the tactics at the Saturday, and Jockey would have all that set out. And any time the players any player had a query about something, it was always Jockey they would go and ask. But on the match day, Alec would come in the dressing room and do the team talk. He was a kind of, figurehead type person. Come in and do the team talk, and then hand over to Jockey to do a bit of a team talk as well. And I think maybe Jockey thought that he would maybe another opportunity where he could do the whole thing, where he was totally in charge. Because I think there was maybe, as there always are when two people talk about football, there's maybe some disagreements about some things, So I think Jockey was at the stage, he'd already been a manager, obviously, at Dundee. So I think when the opportunity came up to be a manager on his own right, then I think that's why he left. But it definitely left a big hole at the club, because Jockey, he was a guy that did all the training, did all the functions, did all the shadow play and all that kind of stuff. So he was a tremendous loss when he left. Yeah.
And that sort of era as well. It's when you were obviously, unfortunately, getting a lot of injuries, so you weren't playing as much in that time. And there were other players coming in like Lee Richardson, Paul Kane, starting to play in the midfield, very similar position to yourself. And then 92-93 wasn't a bad season. They finished the team finished second and everything. So again, there's that positivity that maybe we can kick on again. And then the following year, you play your last full season with the club. You play a lot more games again, and then finish second in the league. There's so many draws that season, 21 draws in the league. I think it was still 2 points for a win then, wasn't it, as well? And the game against Torino in the Cup Winners' Cup as well. That last season, obviously, you'd come back. You're playing a lot more. Were you still feeling it? Were you still feeling good about your game? Were you happy with that season, your last season at the club?
Yeah, we're just happy to be back playing, because I picked up a Achilles injury on my left side, my left ankle, and I ended up, I was out for 18 months with that, and then trying to come back from that. I had 2 operations on the Achilles at the time. Eric Ferguson, the physio from Dundee, came to the club halfway through that period, or maybe a year into that injury that I had. And he actually took me after my second operation, which I went down to London for. And the surgeon down in London, who was an Achilles expert, said I had badly damaged the Achilles by doing the wrong type of stuff with it when I was trying to rehabilitate after my first operation, and I had kind of blown a hole through the middle of the tendon and that type of thing. He was going to stitch it back together, see how it went, but he said, you might not be able to play at that level again. So I got that done. As I say, Eric Ferguson had came to the club. He took me for rehabilitation after I had the plaster off it. I had the plaster off for 12 weeks or something. Took it off, and I was maybe 3-4 months in terms of just very slowly rehabilitating that before I could fully run about and that type of thing. So I was just pleased really to get back and back playing. And Eric told me at the time you might find that you'll have the same problem, because the problem I had with my Achilles wasn't really a serious problem to begin with. It was just because I'd handled it badly in terms of doing the wrong type of training and my rehabilitation that set it back again. So he said, you'll probably find your other Achilles will go as well. It's just scar tissue you get on it. And he says, if your left one gathers scar tissue like that, there's a big chance that your other one will too. So right enough, 6 months later, the other one went the same way. And he said, just keep playing. It was very sore, but it eased off as I was playing through games. He says, well, you're not going to do any damage. Just keep playing as long as you can handle the pain side of things. And then we'll get it cleaned up, and it will be, this time, he says, it will be about 6 weeks, until 6 to 8 weeks, and you'll be back. So we did that, and it was the same thing happened. In to get the operation, stuck on for 4 or 5 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks rehabilitation, and I was back playing. And I always think back to that in my career. A year and a half I was out with that first one because it wasn't handled properly. And the second one, identical, 2 months. And I always look back on that and I thought, geez, that's more than a year out of my playing career for no reason. So I really regret that and think that was not handled very well. But anyway, but at that point, I was getting on a wee bit. I was 33, coming 34. And Willie had taken over as a manager. Jim Bett was leaving, Alec McLeish was leaving. I think maybe Willie at the time was looking for some younger players or things to come in. He played the game in a slightly different way from what previous manager had, Alex Smith. So maybe suitable for different types of players. But what came out of that was a move to Kilmarnock, which was my hometown side. And I was really pleased to get the opportunity to play there for a couple of years before I finished my career. And I had no problems with the Achilles tendons either until I finished my career, I think 3 years later. But I had problems with the legs. When you run anymore. But I played till I was 37, so I was very happy with how it went. A few regrets along the way, but I have to say that in general, for an ordinary player like myself, it was a decent career to look back on.
So what just when you look back then at your 8 years, 7, 8 years at Aberdeen, what are the big highlights? What are the ones that you look on and make you smile?
Well, the highlights are that period I spoke about, winning the 2 cups, and then the low light following almost immediately with losing the league in the last day of the season. So in that period there are main highlights and the big low light, and also the injury that I had as well. But just playing with a club like Aberdeen is a fantastic thing because you are looking to win things. They're very ambitious, and just being involved in the environment where there's a real winning environment is just opens your eyes to what that type of thing's like as well. Another thing looking back, I think, is probably some missed opportunities because in terms of moving, as I say, agents were just a new thing. They weren't very common at the time, but they were operating, and there was a couple of kind of potential moves came to light. One of them when Ian Porterfield was the manager, actually, and the agent that used to take us on pre-season to Germany and Holland, he would organise all that for Fergie or Archie or Alex Smith. He came to me and said there was a club interested in signing me at France. I was in and out of the team a bit with Ian Porterfield, and he was the manager. So the club was Lyon in France, and he had taken Eric Black across to France. He'd taken Mark McGee to Germany and Murdo MacLeod to Germany, that type of thing, this agent. So I knew it wasn't I knew he was capable of doing it. So I actually went over to France with him to visit Lyon and visit the manager there. We went to a Mets game before, stayed with Eric Black that night. He was playing with Mets. And we went to that game and just to let me see the kind of style of football in France, which was very good. I liked the style. Spoke to them about a house and a car and all the rest of it, and wages that were 5 times what I was getting at Aberdeen, and everything was sounded great. So I then got on a plane to go back home, and the agent says, right, the 2 clubs are just finalising the fee. So I went back home, got off the plane in Aberdeen Airport, picked up the evening paper, front page headline, Ian Porterfield sacked. So when I got to Pittodrie in the morning, Ian Donald, I think it was Ian Donald, one of the directors, had spoke to me and said, look, there's going to be a new manager coming in, so we're not going to be doing anything in terms of transfers until we see what the new manager wants. So as luck would have it, or depending on what way you want to look at it, bad luck would have it or good luck would have it. I suppose you can look both ways, because when Alex Smith and Jockey Scott came in, they did a great job and I enjoyed my time there. But Alec and Jockey come in, and Jockey, obviously my ex-manager, had said to Alec, no, we're going to keep him. And basically just pulled me in and said, look, we know you've been over in France and a possible deal, but we're not going to let you go. You're going to be staying here. And that was the end of it. I just got on with it and look back now and think, I wonder what would happen if I'd went to France to live, with the family and all the rest of it. Just these kind of sliding doors type thing, different.
Well, that's it. That's very true. Very true. But a great spell at Aberdeen, and one that's fondly remembered by the fans. The fans always fondly remember you, of course. But from a personal standpoint, I first started, I was about 8-9 years old when I first went to Pittodrie. So about that 1990-91 era. And just doing this has given me the opportunity to speak to some of the guys like yourself, and I spoke to Brian last week as well. Guys that were in the teams when I was growing up. It's just an absolute joy to talk to you. A real treat. I really appreciate your time, Robert. I really do.